In the small town of Ash Hollow, surrounded by dense woods and a river that seemed to whisper secrets when the wind blew just right, stood an abandoned house. Locals called it the Black Hollow Manor. It had once been the grand estate of the Alder family, who mysteriously disappeared over a century ago. The stories said their laughter still echoed through the halls, trapped in the decaying wood and peeling wallpaper. Harper Ellison, a journalism student known for her fascination with the paranormal, decided to spend the night there for her college thesis. She wasn't from Ash Hollow and didn't know that few who dared enter the manor left unchanged. Her friends begged her not to go, their warnings a chorus that fell on deaf ears. Armed with her flashlight, a voice recorder, and a notebook, Harper pushed open the front door with a groan that sent a shiver down her spine. The air inside was colder than the crisp October night outside. Dust motes danced in her beam of light, and the smell of mildew and forgotten memories filled her nose. Just stories, she whispered to herself, the sound swallowed up by the silence. But when she stepped further in, she could have sworn the floorboards sighed, like a house taking a breath. The grand staircase stood before her, a fractured spine leading to the second floor. Its banister was broken, shards of wood sticking out like jagged teeth. A portrait of the Alder family hung above the staircase, mother, father, and their 3 children, all smiling in a way that seemed more menacing the longer she stared. A sudden sound echoed from the room to her right, a faint tapping like nails on glass. Harper's pulse quickened as she turned toward it, flashlight trembling in her hand. She pushed open the door to reveal the manor's parlor. A cracked chandelier hung like a giant spider from the ceiling, and a grand piano sat at the far end, its keys yellowed and covered in a thick layer of dust. Tap, da-da, tap, da-da, tap, da-da. The noise was coming from the window, but when she approached, there was nothing but the dark reflection of the forest and the glint of the river behind her. She exhaled a shaky breath and turned to leave when the piano let out a deep, dissonant note. Harper spun around, her flashlight beam falling over the keys. They were unmoving, yet the sound seemed to echo in her ears. Her heart thudded like a drum beat. "Is someone there?" she called, her voice straining to sound brave. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on her chest. But then, as she strained to listen, she heard a child's giggle, light and airy, like the wind through autumn leaves. It came from upstairs. A chill slid down her spine and her body rebelled at the idea of going up those stairs, but curiosity tugged at her feet. Step by step, she ascended, the creaks beneath her feet feeling almost like whispers urging her on. The second floor was even colder, with the air tasting metallic, like blood. Harper's flashlight flickered, casting shifting shadows that made her doubt her vision. She swept the beam across the hallway, past doorways with doors hanging on broken hinges. And then it landed on a figure standing at the end of the corridor. A little girl in a tattered white dress, her hair in ringlets, stared back at Harper. Her eyes were wide and dark, too dark, and a sickly smile stretched across her pale face. "Hello," Harper whispered, barely able to form the word. The girl raised her hand, pointing to the door beside her. Harper swallowed, each step toward the girl feeling like wading through thick water. As she neared, the girl dissolved into smoke, a cold draft sweeping past her like a breath. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a child's bedroom frozen in time. Toys lay scattered across the floor, and a broken rocking horse sat in a corner, its painted eyes cracked and staring. The music box on the dresser began to play, its tune delicate and haunting. Harper's breath came in shallow gasps as she approached it, feeling the air thrum with an energy that seemed to vibrate in her bones. She lifted the lid, revealing a tiny ballerina that spun and jerked, as if struggling to dance. Suddenly, a voice rasped behind her. "Why did you come?" Harper spun, flashlight stuttering, and there stood a figure draped in shadows. It was tall and hunched, its limbs too long, fingers tipped with sharp, blackened nails. The thing stepped closer, its eyes burning coals in a face that was almost human, but not quite. It smiled, revealing a mouthful of jagged teeth. Harper stumbled back, knocking the music box to the floor. The ballerina's song warped, slowing to a deep groan. The creature's grin widened as it spoke, its voice layered, as if many voices spoke at once. "They wanted us to play forever." Harper's mind screamed for her to run, but her legs were cemented to the floor. The room darkened, and the cold seeped into her skin, deeper than any winter chill. Then the laughter started again, more children now, blending into cries that echoed in her ears. The figure loomed over her, its shadow swallowing her whole as her vision blurred. With a final burst of adrenaline, she threw herself toward the hallway, stumbling and falling hard. She scrambled on her hands and knees, her flashlight rolling away, casting crazed patterns of light until it stopped, illuminating the stairs. The children's laughter turned into piercing screams as she tumbled down the steps, landing in a crumpled heap at the bottom. Dazed and trembling, Harper forced herself up, her body aching. She grabbed the flashlight and looked back at the staircase. The whispers had stopped. The house held its breath. Without looking back again, she fled into the night, the manor's dark eyes watching her as she vanished into the safety of the woods. The front door creaked shut behind her, sealing the voices inside, at least for now. Harper's hands trembled as she reached her car parked a short distance away. She glanced back once, catching a glimpse of the manor looming under the moonlight, its broken windows staring like eyes that knew secrets too old and dark for words. A chill wrapped around her, squeezing her heart. She pushed the thought aside, fumbled with her keys, and started the engine. The road back to town was a winding ribbon flanked by towering trees. Every shadow cast by her headlights seemed to stretch out like hands reaching for her, clutching at the car as it sped past. Harper's pulse refused to slow, the night's events still replaying in flashes. The girl's hollow eyes, the voice that rasped, and that thing in the room. They were stitched into her mind. Once she reached the safety of her small, dimly lit apartment, Harper bolted the door and collapsed onto her couch. The silence that followed was suffocating, pressing in with a weight that nearly sent her running back outside. She rubbed her temples, trying to make sense of it all. Her voice recorder sat on the coffee table, its red light blinking, almost as if it had a life of its own. She'd left it running the entire time she was in the manor. Harper hesitated before pressing play, her finger hovering over the button. When she finally did, the sound of her cautious footsteps echoed from the tiny speaker, the creak of the floorboards, her own whispered questions. Then came the giggle, faint but unmistakable. Harper's breath caught in her throat. The giggle was followed by silence, and then a voice that didn't belong to her spoke. "She's here now." It was a child's voice, soft but laced with something ancient and knowing. Harper's heart slammed against her ribs. She rewound and played it again, disbelief warring with dread. Suddenly, a sharp knock rattled her door. She jumped, the recorder slipping from her grasp and hitting the floor with a thud. The knock came again, louder this time, as if whoever was outside was impatient. Harper's chest tightened. It was nearly 3 a.m. Who could possibly be there? "Who is it?" she called, her voice breaking on the last word. Silence. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears as she approached the door, peering through the peephole. The hallway beyond was empty, washed in the flickering glow of a faulty light bulb. The knock came again, but this time it echoed from inside the apartment. Harper spun around, eyes darting to the shadows pooling in the corners of the room. The walls felt like they were pressing in on her. The air suffused with that same metallic taste she had felt at the manor. A shape flickered at the edge of her vision, and when she turned, the little girl from the manor stood in the middle of her living room. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her dark eyes seemed to pull at the very fabric of the room. A thin smile curved her lips. "Why did you leave?" the girl asked, tilting her head in a way that made Harper's stomach turn. Harper tried to back away, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. The girl took a step forward, the room darkening as if the night itself had seeped through the walls. With each step, the girl's features grew more distorted, her smile splitting wider, revealing rows of teeth that were sharp, like needles. "You're ours now," the girl whispered, and the laughter started again, louder this time, filling Harper's ears until she thought she might scream. She squeezed her eyes shut and covered her ears, hoping it would all disappear. When she opened them again, the room was silent, empty. The chill still clung to her skin, but the girl was gone. The voice recorder lay on the floor, its light blinking insistently. A small voice whispered from its speaker, one last time, "Come back." Tears streamed down Harper's face as she realized she'd made a mistake far greater than she could ever have imagined. The manor hadn't let her go. It had followed her, and the door was still open. Harper sat frozen, her eyes locked on the voice recorder that now seemed more alive than ever, its blinking light like a heartbeat. The room felt colder, every shadow a threat. She didn't dare move, not even to reach for the blanket that lay draped over the couch. Her mind raced with questions, but one kept echoing. What did they mean by, come back? Your tower. Yes. Before she could muster the courage to move, her phone buzzed, making her jump. The screen illuminated with a message from her best friend Lila. You okay? Haven't heard from you. Weird dreams tonight, and it feels like something's wrong. Eesh. Harper's fingers trembled as she typed back. I'm not okay. Something followed me from the manor. A response came almost instantly. Ik stay put. I'm coming over. Relief washed over Harper, momentarily dulling the edge of her fear. She glanced around her apartment, her eyes tracing every line and shadow. Nothing moved, but the stillness was too loud. The voice recorder sat there, silent now but expectant, as if it knew she wouldn't leave it untouched for long. 15 agonizing minutes later, there was a knock at the door. This time, it wasn't sharp or ghostly. It was Lila's hurried, familiar pattern. Harper rushed to open it and pulled her friend inside, bolting the door behind her. Lila took one look at Harper and frowned. God, you look like you've seen a ghost, Lila said, trying to inject a note of humor but failing as her eyes flickered nervously around the room. I wish it was just that, Harper whispered, sinking back onto the couch. She told Lila everything. The manor, the child, the voice, and now the presence in her home. Lila's face paled, but she listened, her jaw set. We need to do something, Lila said firmly. Get rid of it, whatever it is. How? Harper asked, desperation twisting her voice. Lila looked around the room, then grabbed Harper's laptop and started typing. There's an old superstition my grandma used to talk about. Something about binding restless spirits and closing their connection to you. It might sound ridiculous, but at this point we have to try. Harper nodded, too shaken to argue. The two worked quickly, gathering candles and drawing a circle of salt in the middle of the living room. The voice recorder sat at the center, a dark talisman that had become the focus of their attention. Lila lit the candles, their flames casting wavering light across the walls, making shadows dance like figures, watching from the corners. She chanted softly. Words Harper didn't recognize, but that resonated deep, as if pulling threads of reality together. The room seemed to pulse, the air thickening like the moment before a storm breaks. Suddenly, the voice recorder clicked on by itself, and a child's voice echoed out. It's too late. The candles flared, and one by one the flames died, leaving only the dim light from Harper's kitchen to hold the dark at bay. The temperature dropped sharply, and Harper's breath fogged the air. The little girl appeared again, standing just outside the circle of salt, eyes fixed on Harper with an expression that was no longer innocent, but malevolent. Her mouth moved, but the words didn't match the movement. Instead, the voice came from all around them, layers of voices speaking as one. Come back and finish what you started, or we will come for you. Lila's chant faltered, her eyes wide as she stared at the figure. Harper reached for her, but before she could touch Lila, a powerful gust of wind surged through the room, scattering the salt and extinguishing the last of the candles. The figure of the girl rushed forward, dissolving into smoke that wrapped around them, suffocating and cold. The voice whispered one last time, directly into Harper's ear, chilling her to her core. See you soon. And then, as quickly as it came, the darkness retreated, leaving both women gasping for air. The candles lay melted on the floor, their wax cooling in strange, jagged patterns. The voice recorder was dead, its light gone. Lila looked at Harper, eyes wide with terror. We need to go back, she said, barely above a whisper. Harper nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. The manor wasn't just haunted, it was hungry, and they had stirred it awake. The morning sun rose reluctantly, casting a pale, sickly light over Harper's apartment. It did little to dispel the feeling of dread that had seeped into every corner of the room. Harper and Lila sat in silence, the weight of their decision hanging heavy between them. The manor called to them, its influence palpable even miles away. "We should go now, while it's daylight," Lila said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but Harper could see the tremor in her hands as she stuffed supplies into her backpack. Flashlights, extra batteries, salt, and a first aid kit. It felt like they were preparing for battle, and in a way, they were. Harper nodded, eyes hollow and dark-rimmed from a sleepless night. She grabbed her voice recorder, hesitating only for a moment before shoving it into her pocket. It was a risk to take it back to the manor, but leaving it behind felt even worse. The drive to Black Hollow Manor was silent, except for the low hum of the engine and the occasional rattle of the supplies in the backseat. The town rolled by in a blur, sleepy and indifferent to their quiet mission. As they neared the edge of the woods, the trees thickened, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. When they reached the clearing, the manor loomed before them, unchanged yet somehow more menacing in the daylight. The broken windows glistened like sharp teeth, and the front door stood slightly ajar, as if waiting for their return. Harper's throat tightened as they stepped out of the car. The forest behind them seemed to close in, muffling the sounds of the world. Only the whisper of the river in the distance offered any break in the suffocating silence. They exchanged a glance, unspoken fears reflected in each other's eyes, and walked toward the entrance. The moment they crossed the threshold, a wave of cold washed over them, more intense than Harper remembered. The air felt alive, humming with an energy that made her skin prickle. Lila gripped her flashlight tightly, and they moved deeper into the house. "Where do we start?" Lila asked, her voice low and tight. Harper took a shaky breath. "The child's room," she said. "It started there, and I think it wants us to come back to it." The climb up the grand staircase was agonizingly slow, each creak underfoot like a heartbeat counting down to something unseen. As they reached the second floor, Harper felt the hairs on her neck rise. The hallway stretched out before them, dim and foreboding. The door to the child's room stood slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness beckoning. With a nod, Harper pushed the door open fully. The room looked exactly as it had in her memory, preserved in a state of eerie stillness. The broken rocking horse sat in the corner, and the fallen music box was where she had left it. She bent down, picking it up and winding it slowly. The familiar, haunting tune began to play, its notes wavering in the heavy air. Suddenly, the temperature in the room plummeted. A shadow moved at the edge of her vision, and Harper turned to see the little girl standing in the middle of the room, eyes void of any human emotion. This time, she wasn't alone. Dark shapes shifted behind her, figures with glowing eyes and sharp, predatory smiles. "We came back," Harper said, her voice breaking. "What do you want from us?" The little girl's head tilted, and a voice echoed through the room, though her lips remained still. "To be free." The shapes behind her surged forward, filling the room with a cold, choking wind. Harper and Lila stumbled back, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness pressed in, whispering secrets that scraped against their minds like nails. Lila clutched at Harper's arm, eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" she gasped. The voice recorder in Harper's pocket clicked on, and a static-filled voice crackled through it, layered and deep. "Set us free. Finish it." An idea sparked in Harper's mind, wild and desperate. She fumbled in her bag, pulling out the salt and drawing a circle around them as fast as she could. The dark shapes halted at its edge, their eyes burning with fury. The little girl's smile twisted and she reached out a hand, fingers curling into a fist. The walls shook, and the music box's tune warped, becoming deeper and more distorted. Harper took a deep breath and shouted over the chaos, "We're to end this! Show us how to set you free!" The figures paused, the room shifting as if reality itself had taken a breath. The little girl's eyes softened, and she pointed to the music box. Harper hesitated, then picked it up, feeling its cold weight in her hands. The lid opened wider, revealing an inscription inside that read, "Return what was lost, and the curse will break." Harper's mind raced. What did they lose? She whispered. But then it clicked. The laughter, the voices, the sense of a family trapped in time. The manor wasn't just haunted by spirits, it was holding the Alder family itself. Without thinking, Harper placed the music box back on the dresser and whispered, "We return your memories, your laughter, your life." The room shuddered, the wind dying down as a light, warm and golden, began to spread from the music box. The dark figures recoiled, their sharp edges softening into the shapes of a man, a woman, and children. The girl's eyes welled up with tears, and for the first time, she looked at peace. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice now soft and real. The figures faded into the light, leaving only the sound of the wind outside and the distant call of the river. Harper and Lila stood in stunned silence as the house seemed to breathe one last time, settling into quiet. The curse was broken, and the manor, at long last, was at peace. The silence that followed was so profound it almost felt suffocating. Harper and Lila stood motionless, listening to the stillness as if it might erupt into chaos at any moment. But the room remained calm, bathed in the warm, fading glow from the music box. The oppressive weight that had haunted the manor was gone, replaced by a deep, almost serene quiet. Harper took a deep, shuddering breath and exchanged a glance with Lila. They both wore the same expression of disbelief mixed with cautious relief. The room, once filled with echoes of lost souls, now felt like any other room, albeit one that had been forgotten by time. "Is it over?" Lila asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever spell had been cast. Harper nodded slowly, though part of her still couldn't believe it. The dark energy was gone, replaced with an emptiness that spoke of stories finished and lives set free. "I think so," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. The two of them lingered for a moment longer, looking at the music box as if it might give them more answers. Its delicate tune had long since stopped, and the ballerina inside sat still, mid-pirouette. Harper reached out and carefully closed the lid. A soft clicking sealed the room's secrets within, but it no longer felt threatening, only poignant. "Come on," Lila said, breaking the trance and moving toward the door. "Let's get out of here before we think of any reasons to stay." They walked back down the hallway, the creaks of the floorboards under their feet sounding strangely reassuring now. The staircase seemed less daunting as they descended, the portraits on the walls no longer staring with hidden menace, but simply gazing out with expressions that felt almost normal. When they stepped outside, the sunlight felt blinding. The sharp scent of pine from the surrounding woods hit them, filling her lungs and washing away the last remnants of the manor's stale, suffocating air. Harper's knees nearly buckled with relief, and Lila grabbed her arm, steadying her. "Thanks," Harper said, a weak smile breaking through her exhaustion. Lila grinned back, her own eyes red-rimmed, but determined. "We did it. We really did it." As they walked toward the car, the old manor stood behind them, no longer looming but simply existing, a relic from another time. Harper glanced back one last time, half expecting to see a shadow in one of the windows or hear the faint giggle of a child. But there was nothing, just silence. They drove back to town without speaking, each lost in their own thoughts. The road was bathed in golden light, the morning stretching into a day that felt brighter, more real than any before. For the first time in what felt like forever, Harper didn't feel watched. Back at Harper's apartment, the normalcy of the familiar surroundings felt almost surreal. The kitchen clock ticked softly, and the warmth of the afternoon sun fell through the window in golden bars. Lila sat at the table, stirring a mug of tea while Harper slumped onto the couch, the adrenaline finally wearing off and leaving a hollow exhaustion in its place. "So," Lila said, breaking the silence with a tentative smile, "what do we do now?" Harper let out a breath she didn't know she was holding and managed a weak laugh. "We live," she said. "And maybe, just maybe, we never set foot in another haunted place again." They both laughed, a sound that started small but grew until it filled the room, warm and real. And as the day drifted on, the sun slowly dipped behind the trees, painting the world outside in hues of orange and pink. The manor, its ghost laid to rest, would remain in the forest, a memory of what had been, now at peace. Harper leaned her head back and closed her eyes, the events of the last day swirling in her mind. She knew she would carry those memories forever. But they felt different now. not as weights dragging her down, but as stories. Stories of life, loss, and redemption that she could one day tell, not with fear, but with the respect due to things that had found their end. For now, though, she just let herself rest, listening to the soft, living sounds of her home. The distant hum of cars, and the whisper of leaves in the wind. The manor was finally silent, and so was she. The days that followed were filled with a strange blend of normalcy and unease. Harper found herself catching glimpses of her own reflection and half expecting it to move differently from her, or waking in the middle of the night with the feeling that something unseen was watching. But as the sun rose each day, bringing light and routine back into her life, those feelings began to fade like shadows at dawn. Lila visited often, the two of them becoming nearly inseparable since that night. They spent hours poring over old stories, researching the history of Black Hollow Manor, and piecing together the fragments of the Alder family's tragedy. The records they found told a tale of misfortune, a once wealthy family struck by grief and paranoia after their youngest child, Margaret, had vanished without a trace. Rumors spoke of seances and dark rituals meant to summon her spirit back, efforts that had trapped not only Margaret but the entire family in a purgatory of their own making. One evening, Lila appeared at Harper's door with a leather-bound journal she'd found buried in the archives of the town's library. "You won't believe this," she said, holding it up triumphantly. The journal was brittle, its pages tinged yellow with age, and the faded ink hinted at secrets long buried. Harper took the journal, carefully thumbing through its pages. It was written by the Alder family's patriarch, Elias Alder, and detailed his descent from a hopeful father searching for his daughter to a broken man obsessed with finding answers beyond the mortal realm. "We called to her, and something answered." Harper read aloud, the words sending a shiver down her spine. "Not as she was, but as she became. A shadow wearing the face of our sweet Margaret. Now we are bound, and the house keeps us here." Lila leaned in, eyes wide. "That explains why she wanted to be free," she whispered. "They weren't just ghosts. They were prisoners." Harper set the journal down, the weight of the story pressing down on her. "And we set them free," she said, more to herself than to Lila. The thought brought a bittersweet ache to her chest. It was strange, feeling empathy for people who had lived and died so long ago. But their sorrow had reached out across time, binding them in ways Harper would never forget. The two sat in thoughtful silence for a while until Lila broke it with a smile. "Maybe we should write a book," she said, half joking. "The real story behind the manor." Harper laughed, a sound that felt good in her chest. "Maybe, but not now," she said. "For now, I just want to live without looking over my shoulder." They agreed, letting the journal rest on the coffee table, its cover catching the light from the setting sun. It felt like closure, a chapter finally closed after decades of restless waiting. That night, Harper dreamed of the manor one last time, but it was different. The halls were filled with sunlight, warm and golden, spilling through the windows that were whole and clear. She walked through the rooms, past the rocking horse that now stood proud and untouched. In the nursery, Margaret stood with her parents, their faces peaceful and content, no longer twisted in grief or rage. Margaret turned and smiled at Harper, the innocence of childhood restored. "Thank you," the little girl whispered, her voice carried by the soft breeze that stirred the curtains. Harper woke with the morning light streaming into her room and a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. The echoes of fear and dark memories had finally faded, leaving her with something else: gratitude, hope, and the unshakable knowledge that sometimes even the darkest stories could find their way to the light. The weeks that followed were quiet. Harper and Lila resumed their normal routines, though now there was an unspoken bond between them, forged in the crucible of shared terror and triumph. Life went on, but it was tinged with a newfound awareness. As if the edges of reality were thinner, more fragile, Harper began to write again. The words flowed out of her in the evenings, long into the night as she pieced together her account of the manor and the story of the Alder family. What started as notes became full chapters, each one unraveling the eerie and tragic history that had almost ensnared her as well. Sometimes, Lila would come over and read drafts, offering her insights and laughing over cups of strong coffee. "People will think it's fiction," Lila said one evening, her eyes flicking over a page. They won't believe how real it all was. Maybe that's for the best, Harper replied, closing her laptop with a soft click. Some truths are easier to swallow as stories. As autumn shifted into winter, a fresh snow blanketed the town, muffling the world in a peaceful silence. Harper took walks through the nearby park, her breath visible in the cold air, and found herself reflecting on how things had changed. The fear that had once coiled in her chest had transformed into something quieter, a gentle caution. One particularly crisp morning, Harper received a letter in the mail. It was addressed simply to her name, with no return address. Curious, she tore open the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of old, delicate paper. The handwriting was elegant and unfamiliar. To Harper, in gratitude for your bravery and kindness, our story is now at peace, and so are we. M.A. A chill ran down her spine, but not from fear. Margaret Alder. It had to be. The thought left her stunned, standing in her kitchen with the letter clutched in her hands. 1,000 questions swirling in her mind. The paper seemed to hum with a faint, residual energy, as if it carried the weight of time itself. Lila came over later that day and read the letter with wide eyes. "This is incredible," she said, her voice hushed. "It's like they found a way to reach across the veil one last time." Harper nodded slowly, a smile forming despite herself. "I guess some stories don't just end," she said. "They echo." And that's how they chose to see it. Not as something terrifying, but as a reminder that even in the darkest corners, there were stories of hope and redemption. The manor, now just a forgotten relic in the woods, no longer loomed in her dreams. Instead, it stood as a silent testament to the past, its echoes softened by the voices that had finally found their peace. In the quiet of the following days, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that her life had subtly shifted. The letter from Margaret Alder was tucked safely inside her journal, a secret piece of history she felt compelled to guard. It wasn't fear that lingered now, but a quiet sense of connection, as if she had become part of something much larger and older than herself. One evening, while Harper was deep in her writing, a knock at her door startled her. She glanced at the clock. It was past 10, an unusual time for visitors. Her heart gave a slight jump, the echoes of the manor's memories still capable of stirring her nerves. But when she peered through the peephole, relief washed over her. "Lila," Harper said, opening the door. Lila stood there bundled in a thick coat, cheeks flushed from the cold. She held up a thermos and 2 mugs with a grin. "We could celebrate," Lila said, brushing snowflakes from her hair as she stepped inside. "Your manuscript deserves a toast." Harper laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "You're right. It's finally done," she said, gesturing to the neatly stacked pages on the desk. The story of Black Hollow Manor, as real and chilling as it was, now lived between those sheets of paper, immortalized. They sat by the window, watching snowflakes drift lazily under the glow of the street lamps, the heat of the spiced cider filling the room with the scent of cinnamon and cloves. It felt like closure, a celebration not just of Harper's book, but of surviving, of finding peace. "You know," Lila said, cradling her mug, "I think about them sometimes. The Alders, what it must have felt like to finally be free after all those years." "Me too," Harper admitted. The thought had haunted her in a bittersweet way ever since the night she received the letter. It's strange, isn't it, how something so terrifying can leave you feeling grateful. Lila nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, it's like we were meant to be there, to help them find peace. I guess it makes everything we went through worth it." They sat in companionable silence, the only sound the soft patter of snow against the window. The world outside was blanketed in white, clean and untouched, like a fresh start. As the night wore on, a warmth settled in Harper's chest. The sense of being part of something beyond herself had once filled her with fear. Now, it felt different, like belonging. The manor's ghosts were at rest, their story told, and Harper had emerged stronger, more aware of the unseen threads that connected the past and present. Before Lila left, she glanced back at the desk. "Do you think you'll ever go back there?" she asked, a mischievous glint in her eye. Harper smirked, shaking her head. "Not if I can help it. But if the manor ever calls again, maybe I'll be ready." They shared a knowing smile, and as the door closed behind Lila, Harper felt the weight of the past settle into something lighter, more bearable. She was no longer just a witness to the manor's secrets. She was a guardian of its memory, a storyteller in a world where echoes of history sometimes whispered back. The winter days crept by, each one marked by the gentle rhythm of Harper's routine, and the quiet knowledge that her life had changed forever. The manuscript had been sent to publishers, and now all she could do was wait. The anticipation was both thrilling and unnerving, but Harper found solace in the steady routine of writing, walking, and spending evenings with Lila. One evening, while flipping through a local history book, Harper's phone buzzed with a notification. The number was unknown, and for a moment she debated whether to answer. Something about the timing made her press accept. "Hello?" she said, her voice tentative. "Is this Harper Matthews?" A man's voice asked, smooth and professional. "Yes, this is Harper," she replied, a hint of curiosity in her tone. "This is Charles Emerson from Ichiwilla Press. We received your manuscript about Black Hollow Manor, and I have to say, it's one of the most compelling stories we've come across in years." Harper's heart skipped a beat. She sat up straighter, gripping the phone tighter. "Are you serious?" she asked, her voice barely containing her excitement. "Very. We'd like to schedule a meeting to discuss next steps, royalties, and marketing plans. This is a story that deserves to be told." Harper's mind raced. The manor's dark history, once a source of dread, was now becoming something tangible. Something that would reach people far beyond the quiet corners of her town. They set a date for the meeting, and Harper hung up, feeling the world spin around her in the most exhilarating way. She called Lila immediately. "You're not going to believe this," Harper blurted out before Lila could even say hello. "I don't know, after everything we've been through, try me," Lila joked. "Willow Press wants to publish the book," Harper said, barely able to keep the excitement from bursting through the phone. A moment of silence, and then a squeal of delight came from Lila's end. "That's amazing, Harper. You deserve this." The days leading up to the meeting were a whirlwind of nerves and preparation. When the day arrived, Harper walked into the publisher's office with her manuscript tucked under her arm, the air buzzing with the energy of possibility. Charles Emerson was a sharp-eyed man with a warm smile that put her at ease. They discussed the manuscript, the haunting history it contained, and the way Harper had woven truth and emotion into a compelling narrative. "Do you believe the manor will ever draw people to it?" he asked as their conversation wound down. Harper paused, thinking of the eerie silence that had filled its halls, the ghostly figures, and the final message of gratitude from Margaret Alder. "I think it already has," she said softly. "But now, maybe it will draw them in for the right reasons." The contract was signed, and as Harper left the office, the cold wind of winter nipped at her cheeks, but she barely felt it. The manor, its secrets, and the lives it had touched were now part of her story too. She had faced the darkness and come out stronger, a witness not just to horror, but to redemption. When the book was finally published, it sparked curiosity far and wide. People came to the town not in search of fear, but of history and understanding. The manor stood quietly in the woods, its presence less ominous now, as if it too had found peace in having its tale told. And as Harper watched from afar, she knew that while some stories were dark, their endings could bring light. And that made all the difference. Months passed, and Harper's book slowly gained traction, its eerie but redemptive story captivating readers across the country. The quiet town that had once been wary of the manor was now filled with curious visitors. They walked the streets, looking up at the towering structure nestled deep in the woods, some with fear in their eyes, others with intrigue. The manor's history, once a buried secret, was now a shared story, a part of the town's identity. Despite the increased attention, something strange began to happen. Harper started receiving more letters, not just from readers, but from people who claimed to have had experiences of their own, strange occurrences, inexplicable sights, and feelings of being watched. The first letter had been from a local historian, recalling faint whispers in the dead of night when researching the Alder family. Others wrote of feeling a chill in the air whenever they stood near the woods that bordered the manor. Harper wasn't sure what to make of it. Were these just overactive imaginations? Or was there something lingering? Something the manor had left behind that couldn't be so easily exorcised? One evening, she sat at her desk, staring at one of the letters. It was from a woman in her mid-40s, a woman named Clara, who claimed to have been to the manor as a child, before it had become such a known part of local lore. She spoke of a game she and her brother had played in the woods, a game in which they dared each other to go closer to the house, to touch the old stone walls that had been weathered by time. But she mentioned something that made Harper's skin crawl. I remember the laughter. It wasn't ours. It came from the house. Harper put the letter down, her thoughts racing. Laughter. She had heard that too, hadn't she? In the nursery, when she and Lila had been there, trying to free the spirits. The distant, echoing sound of children laughing, but no children in sight. She shivered, pulling her coat tighter around her as she walked to the window. The wind howled outside and the snow was beginning to fall again. It was as if winter was reclaiming the world, making everything seem distant, cold, and unreachable. The thought nagged at her, and that night, sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it was full of fragmented dreams. Dreams of the manor, of rooms she hadn't seen, of children running through long hallways, their laughter mingling with whispers from a past long forgotten. It was as if the house itself were calling to her again. The next morning, Harper called Lila. "I've been getting letters," she said, her voice low and hesitant. Lila paused. "What kind of letters?" "People who have been to the manor. Some of them say they still hear things, that they still feel it, whatever it is, lingering in the house." Harper's voice faltered as she spoke. "Lila, I'm starting to wonder if we really freed them, or if we just put it to sleep for a while." Lila was silent for a moment. "You're not going back there, are you?" she asked, a note of concern creeping into her voice. Harper hesitated. She had promised herself she was done with the manor. That chapter was closed, but the feeling was gnawing at her. The laughter, the whispers. It was as if the house, the spirits within, were reaching out once again, trying to tell her something. "I don't know," Harper replied, her voice distant. "But I can't shake the feeling that something unfinished is still there. And maybe, just maybe, it's calling me back." Later that week, Harper found herself standing at the edge of the woods again, her breath clouding in the cold air. She hadn't told Lila she was coming, knowing her friend would try to stop her. But Harper needed to see it for herself. She needed to understand. The manor loomed in the distance, its windows dark and foreboding. The once beautiful structure, now a decaying shell. The gates were open, as if waiting for her to walk through, as if it had been expecting her all along. As she crossed the threshold, Harper felt it immediately. The air was thick, heavy with the weight of history and sorrow. It was still there, the sense of something watching her, something lingering just beyond her sight. She made her way inside, her footsteps echoing in the empty halls. The silence felt almost oppressive, the stillness broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards beneath her feet. As she entered the main foyer, her eyes were drawn to the staircase, the one she had climbed all those months ago with Lila. It seemed to stretch higher than before, the shadows at the top of the stairs darker, more impenetrable. And then she heard it, a soft, high-pitched giggle. It came from the second floor, faint but unmistakable. Harper's heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen, staring at the stairs. The laughter grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the sound of children playing. It was something far more unsettling, something malicious. Before she could make a move, the sound stopped, and the silence fell once again, thick and suffocating. Harper's breath caught in her throat as the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She wasn't alone. The house wasn't done with her yet. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, her feet moving almost on their own. She had come here to understand, to uncover whatever lingering presence remained, and she was determined to finish what she had started. Harper's pulse quickened as she ascended the stairs, each step creaking under her weight, each footfall sending an echo through the empty halls. The air seemed to grow heavier, thick with anticipation. She could feel the oppressive presence of the house surrounding her, the shadows gathering in the corners. as though they were watching her every move. The laughter had stopped, but she felt it lingering in the air, like a thread pulled tight, waiting to snap. At the top of the stairs, she paused, her breath catching in her throat. The corridor stretched before her, dimly lit by the faint fading light of day that seeped through the dust-caked windows. She could almost hear the faint whispers of children's voices, distant and incomprehensible, but too close to ignore. Harper's eyes darted from one side of the hallway to the other, scanning the familiar rooms she had once explored with Lila. They looked unchanged, frozen in time, like the house had not aged since her last visit. But something felt different now. The quiet, once welcoming, now felt suffocating. The presence of the manor seemed to pulse with life, or something close to it. She moved forward, her footsteps slow but determined, drawn toward the room at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. Harper had never seen this room before. It wasn't in any of the blueprints or records of the manor she had found. It had been hidden, waiting for her, perhaps. The moment her hand touched the doorknob, a cold rush of air swept past her, a gust that smelled faintly of decay and something older. She hesitated, but only for a moment, before pushing the door open. The room inside was small, dimly lit, with a single window that overlooked the now barren landscape beyond the manor. Dust motes danced in the air, disturbed by the sudden intrusion, but it wasn't the room's appearance that stopped her dead in her tracks. It was the faint, glowing figure standing by the window. A child. She was small, with long dark hair that cascaded over her shoulders like a veil. Her back was to Harper, and she was staring out the window, as if lost in a world Harper couldn't see. The figure radiated a soft, ethereal glow, like moonlight on water. But there was something unsettling about it. Something not quite right. Harper's voice caught in her throat as she took a step forward, but the floorboard creaked loudly beneath her, and the figure turned. For a moment, there was nothing but stillness. Then the child's eyes, dark, hollow, and devoid of life, locked onto Harper's. The smile that spread across the child's face was twisted, predatory, and the air around Harper grew cold, freezing her to the spot. "Why did you leave?" The child's voice was not a whisper, but a sharp, piercing echo that seemed to come from all directions at once. "We were waiting for you." Harper's heart raced, panic flooding her chest as the room seemed to spin. The walls felt like they were closing in on her, the air thickening with a suffocating pressure. The child's form flickered, like a bad television signal, before stabilizing again, still smiling, her hollow eyes never leaving Harper's. I didn't leave you," Harper stammered, her voice trembling. The child's smile widened. "You didn't finish what you started. You freed no one." The words cut through Harper like a blade. The weight of them pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. She hadn't wanted to believe it, but the truth was undeniable. The house, the spirits. It wasn't enough to just tell their story, to release the Alder family's tragic past into the world. The manor's curse hadn't been lifted. It had simply been waiting for the right person to finish what had been begun. Harper took a deep, shaky breath, her hands trembling at her sides. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. The figure's laugh was low and chilling, echoing throughout the room. It wasn't the innocent laughter of a child, but the mocking sound of something much darker. "We never left," it whispered, "and neither will you." With a sudden burst of energy, the child lunged toward her, its hands outstretched, fingers like claws. Harper gasped and stumbled back, but the air around her grew heavier, more solid, as if the house itself was tightening its grip. She turned, her instincts taking over, and ran from the room, the child's cold laughter trailing behind her, relentless and haunting. The hallway stretched out before her, the stairs seeming farther away than they had been moments ago. Harper ran, her breath ragged, her heart pounding in her chest. But no matter how fast she moved, it felt as if the house was drawing her deeper, pulling her back to the room, to the source of the curse. As she neared the stairs, something cold brushed against her arm, sending a jolt of terror through her. She spun around, but there was nothing there, just the oppressive darkness of the manor. Harper's legs burned as she reached the bottom of the stairs, her feet slipping on the old wood. She didn't dare look back, but she could feel the presence behind her closing in. The house wanted her. It wanted her to stay, to be a part of its twisted legacy forever. With every ounce of strength she had, Harper broke through the front door, her chest tight with fear. The cold air of the outside world rushed in, a sharp contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the manor. She ran across the yard, not stopping until the house was nothing more than a dark silhouette against the moonlit sky. Breathing heavily, Harper collapsed to her knees in the snow, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The laughter, the child, none of it made sense. And yet, it was undeniable. She had thought she had freed them, but she had been wrong. The manor still held them, bound by a curse older than time itself, and it wasn't finished with her yet. Harper stood slowly, her resolve hardening. She couldn't walk away. Not again. She would have to go back, to finish what she had started. And this time she wouldn't leave until the curse was truly broken. She just wasn't sure if she would survive the price. Harper stood in the snow, shivering as the cold wind bit at her skin. The manor loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette a stark reminder of what she had just escaped. Her breath was ragged, her heart still pounding in her chest. But there was something else now. An overwhelming sense of determination. She couldn't run anymore. Not after what she had seen, after the chilling words of the child. The house had already claimed her once in a way. But this time Harper wasn't just running from the darkness. She was running toward it, toward the truth. She had to finish this. Wow. Her feet crunched through the snow as she made her way back to the edge of the woods. The wind howled around her, the trees creaking in protest as if warning her to turn back. But Harper's mind was set. She had been given a chance to make things right, to free the spirits trapped in that accursed place, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. As she approached the manor, the gates creaked open slowly, as if welcoming her back, drawing her in. The house seemed different now. It wasn't just the same dark structure she had left behind. It felt alive, breathing, waiting for her return. The energy in the air had shifted, and the whispers from before were back, faint and distant, like murmurs from another world. Harper's fingers tightened around the hem of her coat as she stepped forward, her heart racing. She had come prepared this time, no longer naive, no longer thinking a story alone could break the curse. She had read the old books, scoured every history and account she could find. She knew what had to be done. The child's words echoed in her mind, sending a chill down her spine. Your way never left, and neither will you. Be the house, the spirits. It wasn't just about telling their story. It was about releasing them. It was about undoing the damage done so long ago, when the Alder family had sought to bind themselves to the manor. Only then would the curse be broken, and the spirits freed. But what if the cost was more than she could bear? Her feet moved on their own as she entered the manor, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and resolve. The hallways seemed even darker now, the air heavier, suffocating, as if the house itself were trying to swallow her whole. The laughter she had heard earlier still echoed in the recesses of her mind, and she could almost hear it now, soft and distant, like a warning. The door to the room where she had encountered the child was still ajar. Harper hesitated only for a moment before she pushed it open. The room was as cold as before, and the figure of the child was gone. But something was different. Something had shifted in the space. The oppressive feeling was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. Harper stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the room. There was no sign of the child, but as she turned to face the window, something caught her eye. A faint glow lingered on the wall, as if something had left an imprint, a mark of its presence. Her pulse quickened. She walked toward the wall, her fingers brushing against the cool surface. The glow was faint, but there, lines etched into the wood, old markings that had been hidden beneath layers of dust and time. They were familiar. Symbols. The same ones she had seen in the journals, the ones the Alder family had used to bind themselves to the house. Harper's mind raced. She knew what these symbols were. They weren't just marks. They were part of a ritual, a binding. A binding that had kept the spirits trapped for generations. But the ritual wasn't finished. The last step had been left incomplete, and that's why the spirits were still here. That's why the house hadn't released them. With a deep breath, Harper stepped back and opened the small bag she had brought with her. She retrieved a book she had found in the library, a text that contained the final piece of the ritual. It was risky, dangerous even, but it was the only way to break the curse. Harper had no choice. She began to read the words from the ancient text, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. As she spoke the incantation, the room around her began to shift. The temperature dropped, the shadows lengthened, and a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the very walls of the manor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a sudden violent force, the ground trembled beneath her feet. The house seemed to groan, like a living, breathing entity that was being forced to yield to an unseen force. Harper's heart pounded in her chest as the hum grew louder, the symbols on the wall beginning to glow brighter. She pressed on, reading faster now, desperate to finish the incantation before the house could fight back. The air crackled with energy, and for a brief moment, the shadows seemed to take shape, swirling around her like a storm. Then, with a deafening crash, the lights flickered and went out. The room fell into darkness. Harper stood frozen, her breath caught in her throat. The silence that followed was suffocating, and the weight of it pressed down on her chest. Had it worked? Or had she failed? A soft sound broke the stillness, a sound she recognized all too well. Laughter. It was faint, but it was there, echoing through the walls of the manor, growing louder with each passing second. But this time, it was different. It wasn't the same haunting, malicious sound she had heard before. This laughter was light, joyful, like children playing, free, unburdened. It filled the air, and as it did, the oppressive weight that had suffocated the house seemed to lift. The walls groaned again, but this time it wasn't with pain. It was as if the house itself were stretching, waking up from a long, cursed slumber. Harper turned toward the door, her heart racing. She was not alone anymore. The spirits were gone. The curse had been broken. The house was silent now, no longer alive with the energy of the past. Harper stood alone in the middle of the room, the book still clutched in her hands. She could feel it, feel the peace that had settled over the manor like a blanket. The child, the spirits, they were free. But Harper wasn't sure if she could leave without a trace of herself behind. As she turned to walk out of the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within her too. The manor had claimed her once, and it had let her go. And now, it would never call her back again. Harper stepped cautiously out of the room, her mind still reeling from the events that had just unfolded. The manor was quieter now, almost too quiet. The air felt lighter, no longer thick with the oppressive presence that had once clung to every corner. She could hear the soft creaking of the floorboards beneath her feet, the house settling as if waking from a deep, troubled sleep. For the first time in months, the haunting laughter was gone. The whispers had faded into nothing. The spirits, it seemed, had finally been freed. But something still gnawed at the edges of her mind. She had done what she came to do. She had completed the ritual. She had broken the curse. And yet, as she moved through the manor's empty halls, she couldn't shake the feeling that the house still held a secret, a piece of itself that it wasn't ready to let go of. Harper paused at the foot of the grand staircase, her gaze drifting toward the door she had walked through so many times before. The door that had always felt like the barrier between her and the unknown. The door that had once beckoned her in, that had lured her into its mysteries, was now wide open, revealing the cold night beyond. The moon hung low in the sky, casting a pale light over the snow-covered grounds. She had come so far, but there was still a part of her that wanted to make sure. A part of her that needed to know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the house was truly finished with her. The wind outside howled, and Harper turned back to the darkened hallway behind her. Her fingers tightened around the book she still carried, as if for reassurance. She had learned so much in such a short time, but there was still a question lingering, unspoken in the back of her mind. Had she truly freed the spirits, or had she merely delayed their departure? Without another thought, she started up the stairs again, this time with purpose. The second floor was silent, the air cooler than before, but nothing seemed out of place. She walked slowly, methodically, retracing her steps toward the room where the child had appeared. The door was still ajar, but now it seemed more like a void, an empty space that swallowed the light around it. As Harper stepped inside, her breath caught in her throat. The room was different. The glow that had once marked the wall where the symbols had been etched was now gone. The walls, once thick with the weight of the curse, now seemed normal, ordinary, almost peaceful. But Harper knew that wasn't possible. Not entirely. She turned in place, her eyes scanning every corner. The silence in the room felt different this time. Less oppressive, but more profound. Like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. Or perhaps waiting for her. And then, as if it had always been there, a voice spoke. "You did it, Harper." Harper spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. Standing in the center of the room, in the place where the child had been only moments before, was a figure, a shadowy, translucent shape, barely visible, but there nonetheless. It was the child, but she was different now. Her form shimmered, as if made of mist, and her hollow eyes no longer bore that sinister emptiness. Instead, they were filled with something that Harper couldn't quite place. Something soft, something almost... You're free," Harper whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. The child nodded slowly, her smile gentle. "We are," she said, her voice soft but clear. "You freed us. You did what we couldn't." Harper stood frozen, her hands gripping the book tightly in her hands. "But I thought there was a price. I thought I had to." Her voice trailed off, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her chest. The child's figure shimmered again, and for a moment it seemed as if she might vanish, but then she spoke again. Her voice no longer distant, but filled with a quiet warmth. "No price, Harper. Not for you. The curse was never yours to bear." She paused, glancing around the room, her form flickering. "The house, it was always tied to us, to our grief. We bound ourselves here to escape the pain of what happened, but it was never meant to hold us forever. It was meant to remind us, to keep us from forgetting, until someone could set us free." Harper's throat tightened as she listened. The child's words were like a soft echo of everything Harper had tried to understand. The Alder family hadn't just bound their spirits to the house out of some twisted desire for power. It had been a desperate attempt to avoid facing the tragedy that had consumed them. They had been trapped by their own guilt, their grief too great to allow them peace. Harper took a tentative step forward. "But if you're free then, what happens now?" The child's form flickered again, but she smiled. "We move on, and so do you." Harper felt a deep sense of relief, mixed with something else, something bittersweet. The house was no longer the dark, suffocating place it had once been. The spirits were at peace. The curse had been broken. And yet, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that something had been left behind. That the house had been a part of her now, just as she had been a part of it. The child's figure began to fade, dissolving into the air like mist. Before she disappeared entirely, she turned back to Harper and whispered, "Thank you." Harper stood still as the last trace of the child vanished. The room was silent again, the peaceful quiet of a place that had finally found rest. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the stillness. The battle was over. The curse had been broken, but the memories, the lessons, would stay with her. And as Harper made her way down the stairs, stepping out of the manor for the last time, she couldn't help but feel that the house was no longer just a structure of stone and wood. It had become part of her, woven into her life in a way she hadn't expected. The manor, once a prison for spirits, was now a place of peace. And Harper had learned that some things, some stories, weren't meant to be forgotten. They were meant to be remembered, to be understood, to be set free. And for the first time in a long while, Harper felt a sense of closure. The house was done with her, and she was done with the house. As Harper walked away from the manor, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder one last time. The house stood behind her, its once imposing silhouette softened by the pale light of the moon. It no longer felt like a threat. No longer a dark, foreboding entity, but a quiet relic of a painful past. For the first time, she didn't feel the weight of its eyes on her back. Yet, as she took another step, A strange feeling washed over her, an unsettling tug in the pit of her stomach. She paused, looking back toward the gates of the manor. The wind stirred the branches of the trees, their bare limbs swaying as though reaching out to her. Had she truly left it behind? And the house, though silent now, still lingered in her thoughts. It was as if it had imprinted something within her, something that couldn't be erased. Without thinking, Harper found herself walking back toward the gates, her feet moving with an urgency she couldn't understand. She needed to be sure. She crossed the threshold of the manor's grounds once again, and the air seemed to grow colder, the shadows stretching longer as if the house itself was pulling her in, beckoning her. The quiet that had settled in the walls of the manor now felt heavy, expectant. Harper knew something was wrong. It was subtle at first, like a whisper at the edge of her consciousness. She heard it, faint, as if carried by the wind, the sound of footsteps behind her. She spun around, her pulse quickening, but there was no one there. The moonlight cast an eerie glow on the snow, the ground untouched, still and undisturbed, but the feeling remained, that gnawing sensation that she wasn't truly alone. It wasn't the laughter of the spirits that had once plagued the halls. It was something more sinister, something that had been there all along, hiding in the shadows. As Harper turned back toward the house, her eyes fell on the window she had looked through so many times before, the one in the room where the child had first appeared. A faint flicker of light danced inside the window, and for a moment, Harper could have sworn she saw the shape of a figure standing there, watching her. Her breath caught in her throat. No, she thought, shaking her head. It's over. They're gone. And here, why? I was not sure. But the more she tried to convince herself, the more that unsettling feeling gripped her. Something was wrong. The house, no, the manor, wasn't finished with her. She could feel it in her bones, the tension in the air thickening like a storm on the horizon. Harper turned, running back to the front door without hesitation, pushing it open with a force that surprised even herself. The door groaned in protest, but it gave way. The moment she stepped inside, the temperature dropped dramatically. A chill wrapped around her, sinking into her skin, filling her with dread. It was as though the house had been waiting for her return, welcoming her back in the only way it knew how, through fear. The floor creaked beneath her feet as she ventured further into the manor. The silence seemed to suffocate her, a deep, suffocating silence that crawled into her mind and twisted her thoughts. The lights in the hallway flickered weakly before completely dying, plunging her into darkness. Harper fumbled through her bag, pulling out the small flashlight she had brought with her. Its beam cut through the darkness, illuminating only a few feet ahead of her. The walls, once so oppressive, now seemed to bend toward her, closing in as if the house itself had a hunger that could never be satiated. She reached the stairs again, her feet echoing in the silence as she ascended toward the second floor. There was no going back now. The house had pulled her in, and she knew it would never let her leave again. At the top of the stairs, the hall stretched out before her, like a long, winding path through shadow and light. The door to the room where the ritual had been completed stood at the far end, slightly ajar, just as it had been before. But now, the air was thick with an unnatural energy. Something was waiting for her. Harper hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. She didn't know what she expected to find, but her heart raced as she walked toward the door. Knowing that whatever waited inside, she couldn't turn away from it. She had to face it, whatever it was. When she pushed the door open, her flashlight flickered once more before stabilizing, casting its weak light across the room. The child's figure was gone, but something else was there, something far worse. The room was filled with shadows that didn't belong. They seemed to twist and writhe, like sentient creatures, crawling along the walls and ceiling. In the center of the room stood a large, cracked mirror, its surface darkened with grime and age. But as Harper's eyes fell upon it, she saw something that made her heart stop. A reflection. In the mirror, Harper could see herself, but not as she was. Her eyes were wide and hollow, her face pale and gaunt, a twisted smile curling at the corners of her lips. She looked wrong in a way that went beyond simple fear. The shadows in the room seemed to be drawn to her reflection, their movements synchronized with hers. But there was something else, something that shouldn't have been there. A figure stood just behind Harper in the reflection. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, its features obscured by darkness. The figure's presence radiated an overwhelming, oppressive energy, and Harper could feel it deep in her bones. She spun around, her breath coming in ragged gasps. But the room was empty. The air was still. The figure was gone. But it had been there. She knew it. The shadows in the room shifted again, and Harper stumbled back, her legs weak beneath her. The mirror seemed to grow larger, its surface rippling like water. And then, with a sharp crack, the glass shattered. The pieces fell to the ground, scattering like broken dreams. But as they did, a figure emerged from the shards, stepping into the room. It was no longer just a reflection. It was real, and it was coming for her. Harper backed away, her heart pounding in her chest, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, its dark presence filling the room, suffocating her. She could feel the weight of its gaze, like it was pulling her in, forcing her to look. And then, in a voice that was both a whisper and a scream, the figure spoke. "You're not free, Harper. You never were." The words echoed in her mind, drowning out everything else. The house had never let her go. Not really. It had only been waiting for the right moment. Harper turned to run, but the shadows moved faster, wrapping around her like chains, pulling her back toward the mirror. The house was alive, and it had no intention of letting her leave again. The door slammed shut, and the room fell into total darkness. She had thought she was free, but the house had always known. There was no escape. Not for her. And now, it had her. Forever. Harper's pulse raced as the darkness closed in on her. She tried to move, but the shadows held her in place, suffocating her like a vice. Her legs trembled, but she couldn't even summon the strength to break free. The dark figure, its form now clearer in the flickering shadows, loomed over her, its presence crushing. The coldness from the house seemed to seep into her very bones, and a sharp, biting chill filled the air. "Let me go," Harper gasped, her voice barely a whisper. But the figure didn't answer. It simply stared at her, its eyes glowing faintly from within the shadows, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. "You thought you could escape?" it whispered, the words a low hiss, reverberating through her mind like an echo from another world. But this house, this place, it was never about the spirits. It was about you. You were always meant to stay. The shadows tightened around her, each breath she took harder than the last. Panic flooded her mind. No, she thought, this can't be happening. But no matter how much she fought, the darkness seemed to wrap around her tighter, pulling her deeper into its cold embrace. "Who are you?" Harper managed to choke out, her voice shaking with terror. The figure's grin widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too unnatural. "I'm the one who was never meant to be forgotten, the one who watches, who waits." Harper's breath caught in her throat as the figure's form shifted, the darkness that clung to it twisting and growing. Slowly, it stepped forward, its presence engulfing the room. "You think the curse was broken," it murmured, its voice soft but filled with a dreadful finality. "You think you freed the spirits, but you never understood. You were the key. Not the ritual, not the child. You." Harper's heart pounded painfully in her chest. "What do you mean? I broke the curse. I did what I had to do." The figure shook its head, its grin widening until it seemed to stretch across its entire face. "You were never meant to break anything. The house was never meant to be freed." It took another step closer, and Harper felt the air grow heavier, as if the very walls were closing in around her. "You thought you could erase the past, erase the pain. But the house remembers, and it remembers you." Harper's eyes widened in horror as the realization slowly crept over her. The house wasn't just haunted by the spirits of the past. It was alive, and it had always been watching her, waiting for the right moment. The curse had never been broken. It had simply been redirected. The shadows shifted, and Harper could feel the walls of the room vibrating as though the house itself was breathing. The floor beneath her feet groaned, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. The figure reached out, his shadowy hand hovering just inches from her face. "You were always the final part of the puzzle, Harper," it said. The house knew. The ritual you performed, it wasn't to free the spirits, it was to bind you. The darkness seemed to pulse with life as the figure moved closer, its presence smothering every inch of the room. Harper tried to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. She was suffocating, drowning in the overwhelming weight of the house presence. No, Harper's mind screamed, but her body refused to move. The shadows pressed in on her, and she felt herself being drawn toward the figure, as if the very house itself was pulling her into its depths. "Let me go," she cried again, her voice hoarse, panicked. But the figure didn't answer. It simply moved closer, its form shifting, blurring at the edges, until it was right in front of her. Then, it spoke again. Its voice low and cold, like the whispers of the house itself. "You are home, Harper. The house has always been your home. And now you will stay." In that moment, Harper felt it. The final tug, the complete pull of the house. The walls seemed to dissolve around her, leaving her standing in an endless black void. She could hear her heartbeat echoing in the silence, her breath ragged and shallow. The shadows wrapped around her like a cloak, consuming her entirely, pulling her deeper into the darkness. The house had won. The house had always known. And now, she was a part of it. Outside, the wind howled, as if in mourning. The snow continued to fall, covering the ground in a soft white blanket, but the manor stood still, silent as the grave. The doors, once wide open, had closed again, and there were no signs of life. No one would ever know what had truly happened inside. No one would ever know that Harper had become part of the house, that she had joined the countless others who had once walked through those doors, never to leave again. And the manor, it would wait. It would always wait, until the next soul wandered in, unaware of the fate that awaited them. In the cold, endless night, the house was quiet once again, but it was never truly silent. It was always hungry, always watching. The night pressed on in an unnatural stillness. The snowflakes continued to fall from the sky, each one adding to the quiet blanket that covered the grounds of the manor. Within the walls of the house, the air was thick with an ominous energy. It was as though the very foundation of the manor breathed with a life of its own. The shadows stretching and shifting in the corners, hungry for more. Inside, in the room where Harper had last stood, the darkness slowly began to fade, but only in the physical sense. The atmosphere, the presence of the house, remained heavy, suffocating, like a terrible secret that had been buried far too long, only to be unearthed once more. There was a shift in the air, a faint rustling, like whispers, not from the walls, but from deep beneath the floorboards. The house, the manor, it knew what had happened. It knew what had been lost and what had been gained. In the moments following Harper's disappearance, the manor fell into a deceptive peace. But this peace was not freedom. It was the calm before a storm, a time of waiting, of feeding. For a house like this was never truly empty. It was merely patient. The shadows in the corners of the room thickened, swirling as if they had a purpose of their own. And in one of the darker corners of the manor, a door that had been closed for years, its wood warped and peeling, slowly creaked open. The door led into the basement, the heart of the house, most long forgotten, even by the spirits that had once roamed the halls. A place where the house itself had been built upon something far older, far darker. And now, after years of silence, something was stirring in the depths below. Deep within the foundation, far beneath the ground, something began to wake. The house had never been empty. It had merely been dormant, waiting for the right moment to awaken, to consume once again. From the depths of the basement came a low, guttural sound, like the groaning of an ancient beast. The house seemed to tremble, as though it too had been woken from a long slumber. The shadows that had once been only a presence now took form, moving with purpose, creeping through the rooms, flowing toward the stairwell, up toward the second floor. As the house stirred, so did the spirits, but they were no longer the same. They weren't the lost souls that had once wandered the halls, seeking release. There was something more, a twisted, feral manifestation of the house's hunger. The spirits, once bound by the curse, were now free and away, but their freedom was not one of peace. They were now drawn to the heart of the house, just as the house was drawn to them, and together they would feast. Outside in the frozen night, the wind picked up, howling with a violent intensity that rattled the trees and shook the branches. But no one was around to hear it. No one had ever heard it. Not for years. The only ones who had ever truly understood the house hunger were the few who had come too close, too curious, only to be consumed by its insatiable grasp. The manor waited. It always did. But the house was no longer the same. In the dead of night, two travelers found themselves lost on the road, the storm howling so fiercely that they could barely see beyond the fog and snow. They had been on their way to the nearby town, but the blizzard had come suddenly. The map they had been following had led them astray. Desperate for shelter, they noticed the silhouette of the manor in the distance, its dark outline looming against the backdrop of the storm. The imposing figure of the house was like a shadow in the mist, beckoning them with the faintest flicker of light coming from within. Without hesitation, they made their way toward the mansion, their footsteps crunching in the snow as they trudged up the winding path that led to the front door. The door was already ajar when they arrived, the wind having forced it open. The travelers exchanged uncertain glances, but, with no other options, stepped inside, grateful for the warmth they hoped the house could offer. The air inside the manor was cold, but not unbearably so. The silence was overwhelming, a thick presence that seemed to seep into their bones. The faint smell of dust and old wood filled the air. But there was something else, too, something unsettling, like the scent of rot buried deep within the walls. The house was empty, or so it seemed. The travelers moved cautiously through the dimly lit hallway, their breath misting in the cool air. The floors creaked underfoot, and the walls groaned softly as if the house were waking from a long slumber. The hairs on the back of their necks stood on end, but they pressed on, drawn forward by the promise of shelter. They reached the staircase at the far end of the hall. As they began to ascend, the temperature seemed to drop further. It wasn't just cold, it was unnatural, as though the house itself was drawing the warmth from their bodies. The shadows deepened, wrapping around them like tendrils, and the floorboards groaned beneath their feet, as though the house itself was shifting in anticipation. They reached the top of the stairs, and that's when they saw it. A door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar, just like the one at the bottom of the stairs. A flicker of light escaped from within. Curiosity overtook them. They pushed the door open. Inside the room, the air was thick with darkness, but the faint light, flickering like a candle, came from the far corner of the room. It was a mirror, cracked and warped, its surface reflecting nothing but shadows. As they stepped closer, they saw something move in the reflection, something that shouldn't have been there. The travelers froze. The reflection of the room in the mirror was different. It was older. The walls were crumbling, the floor cracked, and there, standing in the center of the reflection, was a figure. A shadowy form that looked like Harper, her face twisted in a haunting grin. Before either traveler could react, the shadows seemed to leap from the mirror. The door slammed shut behind them, trapping them in the room with the dark presence. And somewhere, deep within the manor's walls, a new hunger began to stir. The travelers stood frozen, their hearts pounding in unison, the weight of the air around them growing heavier with every passing second. The door slammed shut behind them with a violent thud, trapping them inside the room. The sound echoed through the manor, but the house responded only with a silence so deep it felt like it was pressing in on them from all sides. The flickering light from the mirror grew stronger, casting long, trembling shadows across the room. The figure in the reflection, Harper, or what had once been Harper, stood still, her dark eyes locking onto theirs, her twisted grin stretching unnaturally wide. It was as though she could see them, feel them, despite being trapped within the glass. Her reflection seemed to reach out, her arms raising as if to pull them into the mirror with her. "Get away from it," one of the travelers screamed, yanking the other back. "That's not her. That's not her real." But no sooner had the words left his lips than the air shifted again, a low, almost imperceptible hum vibrating through the walls. The house, it seemed, had heard them, and it responded with a slow, deliberate shift, a shift that felt like the turning of something ancient and enormous. The figure in the mirror smiled wider. Then, it stepped forward. It was not just a reflection anymore. The room around them seemed to warp, pulling the traveler's attention toward the mirror, where the figure inched closer with each passing second. The walls began to bend, twisting as though the very fabric of the house was unraveling. And a cold, breathless wind stirred the air in the room, making the flickering light dance erratically. "No," the other traveler whispered, his voice trembling with fear, his legs rooted to the spot, as if the house itself was preventing him from moving. "It's not possible. This place is not real." But it was real. The house was real, and it had never been just a building. It had always been something far darker, something that existed beyond time, beyond the comprehension of mortals. It had been waiting, patiently, for them. The figure in the mirror reached out, its hand now extending toward the travelers, but this time, it wasn't just its reflection. It was a physical presence, the shadow of something ancient. The air grew cold, the temperature dropping to an unbearable chill that bit into their skin, the very breath leaving their mouths in small misted clouds. Suddenly, the light in the mirror flared, and in that brief instant, the travelers saw something horrifying. Behind the figure in the glass, the room was no longer the same. It was no longer the decrepit, decaying room that they had entered. It was alive, alive in a way that twisted their stomachs. The walls pulsed with a sickly greenish hue, and strange veins seemed to writhe beneath the surface of the floor. The reflection wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was a glimpse into the heart of the house, into something that was feeding. And the travelers could feel it too, drawing them closer to the abyss. One of the travelers tried to step back, but his feet felt glued to the ground. He could barely breathe as the shadows stretched, reaching for him, wrapping around his body like serpents. His eyes widened with terror as he looked at his companion, but all he saw in return was a blank, hollow stare. The other traveler was no longer in control. He was staring, gazing, into the mirror, his eyes wide and unblinking, as though trapped in a trance. "Dawn." He tried to scream, but his voice was lost in the growing hum of the house, drowned beneath its whispering walls. The dark figure in the mirror had begun to move again, its shadowy form now beginning to break free from the glass. The traveler reached out, desperately trying to pull his companion away, but his hands passed through him like mist. The other man was gone, lost in the reflection, pulled in by the shadows, his body shifting and distorting as though the mirror was swallowing him whole. The figure in the glass stepped forward, its arms now fully extending. The air grew thick with an overwhelming sense of dread, and the room began to close in around them, the walls pressing forward. The floor beneath their feet seemed to buckle, and with a scream that echoed through the manor, the last of the traveler's sanity snapped. He ran, but no matter how fast he moved, he could feel the house pulling at him, dragging him toward the mirror, where the shadows grew stronger. "No," he cried again, but his voice was swallowed by the deep hum that reverberated from the heart of the manor. It was too late. With one final desperate effort, he threw himself toward the door. But the door wouldn't open. It was as if the house had sealed it with an invisible force. He pounded on the wood, his fists bruising against the cold surface, but the walls seemed to tighten around him with each passing second. The shadows in the room pressed closer, and he could feel the figure's cold fingers reach out for him, wrapping around his chest. With a final scream, he was dragged backward into the mirror. And then there was silence. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind howling through the trees. The manor, its dark silhouette barely visible through the blizzard, stood silent once more. The doors that had once been wide open were now closed tight, as if nothing had ever disturbed them. The windows reflected nothing but the snowy wilderness beyond. But within the manor, the house waited. It was no longer the same. Not after the souls it had claimed, not after the dark force it had become. The mirror, cracked and aged, now gleamed with a strange, unnatural light. The shadows that had once been confined to the corners of the rooms had spread, their tendrils reaching into every inch of the manor. The house was full again, and it would wait for the next unwitting traveler, hungry for more. And deep in the foundations, far below, the house murmured, as if content. It was only a matter of time.